Hollywood often extends narrative lines and themes through multiple movies. This started with a sequel, which would take advantage of either a popular initial movie or multiple stories that are already available using the same characters. Recently, studios have taken a broader approach, planning multiple movies at the outset using the same characters to tell an extended tale. Each movie in the series tells a part of the overall story, and to understand the full plot and to observe the main character's full development, the viewer would need to see all of the films. This franchise concept is actually not novel. Hollywood has used it, albeit in a more subtle manner, since the early big studio era. And indeed, this subtle approach continues to this day. In this video, we will discuss how two great directors, John Ford, whose best work was released during the big studio era, and Martin Scorsese, who to this day produces groundbreaking movies, develop character arcs in a subtle fashion through a series of films. Their approach does not use the same character. Rather, it uses a different character in each movie to represent a protagonist. Each film tells the story of how the events and experiences portrayed shape the outlook of the overall protagonist at a particular stage in his life. The first film portrays the early protagonist, young, optimistic, immature, and naive. The second shows the protagonist as an adult, a man at the top of his game, but with dark shadows that indicate that the future is not as bright as it seems. The later films show the protagonist nearing the end of his life, alone, exhausted, and facing the consequences of his earlier actions. Ford uses 4 westerns starring John Wayne: Stagecoach, released in 1939, She Wore Yellow Ribbon, released in 1949, The Searchers, released in 1956, and The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, released in 1962. Martin Scorsese uses 3 of his mobster movies starring Robert De Niro: Mean Streets, released in 1973, 1992's Goodfellas, and The Irishman, released in 2019. Most casual moviegoers in the 21st century probably don't know much about John Ford, but he was one of the preeminent film directors in history. In a career of more than 50 years, Ford directed more than 140 films and was very highly regarded. When asked for a list of his favorite filmmakers, Orson Welles once replied, "I prefer the old masters, by which I mean John Ford, and John Ford." With Ford at his best, you get a sense of what the earth is made of. Akira Kurosawa said of him, "John Ford is really great. That's the kind of director I want to be." And Ingmar Bergman called him the greatest director in the world. Directors today also hold Ford in the highest regard, showing the timelessness of his appeal.
In my generation, he was sort of the granddaddy of all directors at that particular time. He certainly influenced almost everyone who was directing in the 50s and later in the 60s and right on through today.
Ford, will live forever because his films will live forever. And his work is there to inspire and influence this whole new generation of filmmaker.
He is the essence of classical American cinema. And any serious person making films today, in whether they know it or not, is affected by Ford.
Ford has won multiple awards, including the Academy Award for Best Director a record 4 times for The Informer, The Grapes of Wrath, How Green Was My Valley, and The Quiet Man. His outlook was shaped by his knowledge of American history, and many of his films were steeped in its traditions. He has proudly recounted knowing many of the people who helped shape the American West. For example, he has said that Wyatt Earp helped him with the script of My Darling Clementine, Ford's recounting of the shootout at the OK Corral, by describing how the action actually went down. Ford always held his westerns in a special place in his heart. At a contentious Directors Guild of America meeting, he introduced himself by saying, "My name is John Ford, and I make westerns." And indeed he did. Stagecoach was John Ford's first talkie western and his first western in over 15 years. Set in the American West in the late 1800s, a stagecoach sets off across the wilderness carrying an assortment of characters. A drunk doctor, a showgirl, which at that time was a code phrase for a woman of negotiable virtue, a whiskey salesman, the pregnant wife of an army officer on her way to join him at his post, a gambler who volunteers to look out for her on the journey, a bank manager, the local marshal, and the driver. On the way, they pick up the Ringo Kid, played by John Wayne. As it turns out, the Kid is wanted by the law, as he had escaped from prison and was on his way to Lordsburg to avenge the murder of his family at the hands of a gang of criminals. During the ride, the Kid becomes attracted to the showgirl and eventually proposes marriage to her. She is reluctant because she is aware of the implications, but he persists, and at the end of the movie, he extracts his revenge against his family's murderers and escapes to his ranch with his soon-to-be wife, the showgirl. The Ringo Kid is young and enthusiastic, and at the start of the movie, a bit naive. He either doesn't realize or doesn't care who the showgirl is and what that implies. Early in the movie, while having lunch, the others won't sit next to the showgirl, but the Kid mistakenly believes they are shunning him.
Looks like I got the plague, don't it?
Later, as the showgirl helps in the care of the officer's wife and her new baby, the Kid realizes the showgirl's innate humanity and falls in love with her. The showgirl is honest with the Kid. She shows him her life in Lordsburg, fully expecting him to run away, as all society has. But he doesn't. He believes that their love for each other will win out, and he doesn't care about the consequences. After exacting his revenge on his family's killers, he presents himself to the sheriff to be arrested and taken back to prison. But to his surprise, the sheriff lets him go. The last word is given to the doctor.
Well, that's saved from the blessings of civilization.
Throughout this movie, the Kid is an optimistic, noble character who takes great risks, but nonetheless wins out at the end and rides off with the women he loves into the wilderness, safe from the strictures of society, and, presumably, to a happy life together. It's a classic Hollywood ending. A young man whose whole life is in front of him, with so many possibilities for success ahead.
Right by toes! Yo!
She Wore a Yellow Ribbon was the second movie in Ford's cavalry trilogy. Set in the post-Civil War West, it describes the final service days of a career cavalryman, Captain Nathan Brittles, played by John Wayne. Brittles is given one last mission, to prevent a new frontier war that is looming after a breakout by the Native Americans following the defeat of George Custer at the Little Bighorn. This task is complicated by a second order, which is to deliver his commanding officer's wife and niece to an eastbound stage. His two troop officers vie for the affections of the niece, while uneasily anticipating the retirement of their captain and mentor. Also assisting Brittles with his mission are his Irish top sergeant and a veteran who was once a Confederate cavalryman. After failing in both missions, Brittles returns to the fort with the troop. His lieutenants continue the mission, joined by Brittles after he apparently rode off in retirement. Brittles takes it upon himself to try to make peace with his old friend Chief Pony That Walks. When that too fails, he devises a stratagem to avoid a war by stampeding the renegades' horses out of their camp. It works, and Brittles rides off to his retirement. Just before he disappears over the horizon, Brittles is recalled to duty as Chief of Scouts with the rank of Lieutenant Colonel, and the film ends with the troop once again going out on patrol. In the intervening years, the Ringo Kid has developed into Nathan Brittles, experienced and skillful. He is respected by his peers. The willingness of his company officers to put their own careers at risk to follow his orders show both his leadership and their respect for his professional skills. Despite this, there are indications that not all is well. It's known from the outset that he is slated for retirement, and this casts a pall over the whole movie. In addition, there are poignant scenes throughout the movie that foreshadow a darker future. Brittles' reading of the list of cavalry officers killed at the Little Bighorn, talking to his wife at her grave, the defense of Sudrow's Well and the death of Trooper Smith, and the refusal of his commanding officer to allow him to lead the relief mission due to his imminent retirement.
And I thought you were fond of Cohill.
Fond of him?
Every time Cohill gave an order, men would turn around and look at you. They'd wonder if he were doing the right thing. Do you want to ruin the boy?
I know, Mac, but...
And young Pinnell's got to learn to cross a river under fire. So did we. And Cohill's got to run his chances. We ran him, Nathan. That's what we get paid for.
Wayne plays his role to perfection. You can see sadness and weariness in his face as he experiences these events, even though they are not uncommon in an army at war on the frontier. His expression as he chokes up when his troop presents the watch to him on his retirement is a wonder. Wayne always considered his performance in this movie his best, and it's not hard to see why.
Brought on from Kansas City. There's a sentiment on the back of it.
To Captain Brittles from C Troop. Lest we forget.
The end of the movie shows Brittles being recalled to service. Although it's an upbeat ending, there are still portents of a darker future. It's only a temporary reprieve. Eventually, Brittles will have to retire. Chief Pony That Walks told him that the two of them were too old for war, and Brittles recognizes it, and knows that eventually it will be time for him to go.
So Nathan Brittles, ex-captain of cavalry, USA, started westward for the new settlements in California. Westward toward the setting sun, which is the end of the trail for all old men.
Luck has put things off for Lieutenant Colonel Nathan Cutting Brittles, but the end of the trail, eventually, will come. The Searchers is considered by many not only to be Ford's best Western, but the best Western ever. Ethan Edwards, played by John Wayne, returns from the Civil War to the Texas ranch of his brother, hoping to find a home with his family. Soon after his arrival, the members of the family are either killed or abducted by Comanches, and he vows to track down his surviving relatives and bring them home. Eventually, Ethan gets word that his niece Debbie is alive, and along with her adopted brother, Martin Pauly, who serves as the moral voice in the movie, he embarks on a dangerous years-long mission to find her, journeying deep into Comanche territory. As the quest goes on, Martin begins to realize that Ethan's hatred for the Indians is beginning to spill over to include his now assimilated niece. Martin becomes uncertain whether Ethan plans to rescue Debbie or to kill her. Things changed a lot in the world by the time John Ford shot The Searchers in 1955 to 1956, and so has the character played by John Wayne. The optimistic, happy, and somewhat naive Ringo Kid developed into the expert but world-weary Nathan Brittles. In The Searchers, Ethan Edwards has been weary and skeptical for years. 4 years of horror in the Civil War and the loss of the love of his life, first to his brother and subsequently to death at the hands of the Comanches, has left him twisted and bitter. He is hostile, confrontational, skeptical about everyone, and assumes the worst outcome possible in every situation. At the beginning of the movie, when the posse stops by to pick up volunteers to go after rustlers, Ethan is the only one who suspects the worst, a Comanche raid.
Might be that this doddering old idiot ain't so far wrong. Could be Comanche. Kind words, Ethan. Thank you kindly.
After finding the dead cattle, Ethan again correctly guesses that the worst has occurred. The Comanches use the cattle to draw away the men, and have now raided their defenseless ranches, and as it turned out, taken young Debbie hostage. Years later, when Ethan and Martin finally catch up to the Comanches who took Debbie, his cynicism progressed to the point that he was ready to kill her, since living with a Comanche for so many years put her beyond redemption.
Stand aside, Martin.
No, you don't.
It was only the intervention of Martin that saved her life. The end of the extended scene, when Ethan reads his will to Martin, is a nadir of Ethan. You hate him and his views as much as Martin does.
What kind of a man are you anyway?
She's been living with a buck. She's not that
Shut
bad.
your dirty mouth! I hope you die.
That'll be the day.
As Ethan pursues Debbie at the concluding scene of the movie, you are convinced that he is going to kill her. Martin does his best to try to stop Ethan, but fails. Ethan runs her down, and Debbie and the viewer thinks he will finally accomplish his years-long task and kill her. And yet he doesn't, and this brings us to the finale of the movie, which is both redemptive and foreboding. Instead, he picks her up in a gesture reminiscent of an opening scene in the movie, where in a happier time, he picked up the younger Debbie in the exact same way. Ultimately, he brings her back to her former home on the ranch. There, she is welcomed by Martin and her former neighbors, who bring her inside their home. It has all the hallmarks of a happy ending. Except... Ethan never enters the home. He stands outside, watching the celebration, and at the end, turns and walks away as the front door closes behind him. Ethan is not and never will be a member of this or any family. He will always be an outsider, unable to trust anyone, isolated by his character and perhaps by his own choice. He will wander among the winds alone for the rest of his life. But you don't know what actually happens to Ethan. He walks off, the door closes, and that's the end of the movie. What is the ultimate fate of the John Wayne protagonist? I think we can get a view of this from Ford's last great western, The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, released in 1962. The movie starts off with the news of the death of Tom Doniphon, played once again by John Wayne, a man no one in the town of Shinbone remembers. Because he was a pauper and friendless, no one is expected to attend the funeral. Surprisingly, Senator Rance Stoddard and his wife Hallie, played by James Stewart and Vera Miles, arrive by train to attend the funeral. The local townsfolk are honored by their appearance, and the editor of the local newspaper insists on an explanation as to why such a famous person and national figure traveled so far to attend the funeral of a nobody. With prodding from Hallie, Rance reluctantly explains, and the story is told as a continuous flashback to the earlier frontier days of the town. Entering the then unincorporated territory as a young lawyer, Rance is beaten and robbed by the infamous outlaw Liberty Valance, played by Lee Marvin. Tom Doniphon finds Rance and takes him to the town of Shinbone, where Tom's girlfriend, Hallie, treats his wounds. Tom tells Rance that Valance frequently terrorizes Shinbone and the surrounding country, and that Valance only understands force, but Rance is determined to bring Valance to justice through the law. Appreciative of her care of him when he was injured, Rance befriends Hallie and teaches her to read. He also opens a law practice in the office of the local newspaper, whose editor, Dutton Peabody, played by Edmund O'Brien, is impressed by Rance's dedication, but is amused by his naivete. Throughout this period, Rance continues to be bullied and mocked by Liberty Valance, but, as a believer in the law, Rance refuses to take the bait. Meanwhile, the townspeople meet to select 2 delegates to represent them at the upcoming statehood convention at the territorial capital. Rance nominates Tom, who, although is approved by acclamation, declines and instead nominates Rance. In the end, the voters select Rance and Dutton Peabody as their delegates. That evening, Valance and his gang vandalize the newspaper office and severely injure Peabody. Valance once again calls out Rance, and after seeing the injury to Peabody, Rance arms himself and asks people to tell Valance to meet him in the streets for a showdown. Valance easily wounds and disarms the inexperienced Rance and prepares to kill him, but Rance retrieves his gun and shoots, and Valance falls dead. Rance returns to Hallie, where she treats his wounded arm. Tom enters and sees Hallie's clear affection for Rance. He gets drunk and runs Valance's men out of town. Tom then sets fire to his own house, destroying the extension he was building for Hallie and symbolically ending his relationship with her. At the territorial convention, Rance is nominated for delegate to Congress, but after a representative of the cattle barons accuses him of building a career from killing Valance, he feels guilty and withdraws. Tom arrives and explains to Rance that it was he who killed Valance.
Valance came out of the saloon. You were walking toward him when he fired his first shot. Remember? Pompey.
All right, dude. This time, right between the eyes.
Tom then tells Rance he can now be free from his guilty burden, and encourages him to accept the nomination for Hallie's sake. Rance does so, and Tom quietly leaves the convention unnoticed.
She wanted you alive.
Back in the present, the newspaper editor recounts Rance's rising political achievements that filled the intervening years. The editor decides that publishing the story would ruin Rance's legacy and burns the reporter's notes.
Well, you're not going to use the story, Mr. Scott?
No, sir.
This is the West, sir. When the legend becomes fact, print the legend.
He's right, Rance.
As Rance and Hallie return to Washington by train, the conductor recognizes Rance and tells him that he is honored to serve him.
You think nothing of it. Nothing's too good for the man who shot Liberty Valance.
The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance is a dark film. Its premise, when the legend becomes fact, print the legend, is still applicable today. It doesn't matter what the truth is. It matters what people believe to be true. Rance's image was that of a man who could stand up to evil using the law, but had the courage and skills to take care of his own affairs if need be. The truth is that he never had the courage or the skills to take on Liberty Valance, and was only saved by Tom, who let Rance take the credit to help his political career. And the result? Rance goes on to national fame, and Tom dies an unknown pauper. One of the saddest lines of the movie occurs at the beginning, when Rance views Tom's body.
Almost brand new, and I thought...
Put his boots on, Clute, and his gun belt, and his spurs.
He didn't carry no handgun, Rance. He didn't for years.
Yeah, sure.
A gunfighter who no longer wears a gun is a man whose purpose in life has long passed. The image of Tom Doniphon died many years earlier when he burned his house down. His actual death just relieved him of the subsequent years of misery. So how does the John Wayne character develop in The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance? At the beginning, he could be considered a younger Nathan Brittles, a dominant figure in his community who walks amongst his peers with confidence and strength. Even the villains give him a wide berth. But into this world comes Rance Stoddard, a young man whose ideals for a new future do not fit with Tom Doniphon's present. Although Tom realizes the threat, he also understands that he cannot stop the future, and he helps Rance win Hallie and develop his career for the good of Shinbone, and ultimately dies an unknown pauper. We can get a good idea of what John Ford thought of this through the eyes of Rance Stoddard. He clearly is racked with guilt at what he had to do to achieve his success, and the final line is clearly a knife to his heart. Taking all of the characters from the 4 movies discussed in this video, John Ford presents a fascinating, if dark, portrayal of the life and career of the Western hero. The Ringo Kid is the early stage, full of hope and promise of a good future. The kid develops into Captain Nathan Brittles, who now is alone. Although he has developed into a highly competent professional, he is constantly reminded that the end is coming. Brittles becomes Ethan Edwards, who is embittered by his experiences and not only has remained alone, but is fated to be alone forever. Finally, Ethan dies as Tom Doniphon, alone for years, his once valued expertise no longer needed, a pauper whose legacy will forever remain forgotten. So this is the ultimate end for the Ford protagonist: isolation, failure, and anonymity. Like John Ford, Martin Scorsese is a highly respected motion picture maker. In a career spanning over 60 years, Scorsese has directed 72 and produced 96 full-length features and documentaries, and is the recipient of many major accolades, including a Best Director Academy Award for The Departed, released in 2006. Scorsese is also a well-respected film historian, and his documentaries on films are very influential, and indeed have heavily influenced me when I made this video. Martin Scorsese's world is different from Ford's. Instead of being rooted in the history of the Old West, Scorsese grew up in New York City, and so many of his most personal movies are set there. Scorsese's main protagonist in the films we will discuss here is a working-class Italian-American struggling to make a living any way he can on the streets of New York City in the later years of the 20th century. Mean Streets is Scorsese's 3rd film as a director, and the first that bears his full imprint. The plot revolves around Charlie Cappa, played by Harvey Keitel, who is a young Italian-American in the Little Italy neighborhood of New York City, and his reckless younger friend, Johnny Boy Savello, played by Robert De Niro, a small-time gambler, ne'er-do-well, and mobster wannabe. Although Charlie is the lead character in the movie, the initial Martin Scorsese uber protagonist is actually Johnny Boy. The differences between these characters are stark. Johnny Boy is introduced conducting a purposeless act of vandalism, just for the fun of it, whereas Charlie is first introduced while at prayer in church. Reckless, self-destructive, and disrespectful of his mafia elders, Johnny Boy is only looking for a good time and plays fast and loose when he fails in his responsibilities, which is often, whereas Charlie is torn between his devout Catholicism and his dedication to his friends. In an early scene, Johnny Boy fails to meet a loan shark as promised to pay a debt. Instead, he shows up at Charlie's bar in a happy mood, penniless, without trousers, and accompanied by 2 young women that he just met and who he had promised a fun evening. As he fruitlessly asks the bartender for credit so he can buy his new girlfriend's drinks, Charlie drags him to a back room and asks him why he didn't pay the loan shark off. Johnny Boy gives him a poorly conceived and obviously false alibi, adjusting it to fit whatever facts he learns from Charlie. This careless and cocky impulsiveness leads to confrontations and makes him unnecessary enemies, and he constantly needs Charlie to rescue him from situations he finds himself in. Charlie's mafia relatives realize that Johnny Boy is a weight on him and advise him to drop his friendship. As they say, honorable men go with honorable men. Charlie cannot bring himself to do so, and so in the end is dragged down by an ultimately ungrateful Johnny Boy. Johnny Boy is the antithesis of the Ringo Kid, and yet in many ways still represents the same early stage of the protagonist. Unlike the Ringo Kid, there is nothing noble about Johnny Boy. He is not out to avenge an old wrong, he does not see the best in everyone, and he doesn't care what other people think of him. He sees everyone around him as someone whom he can manipulate for his own short-term ends, no matter the cost to others. He cannot even recognize the sacrifice that his good friend Charlie is making for him. Indeed, in one painful scene late in the film, he accuses Charlie of never helping him.
Oh, you mean? What are you talking to me about? What do you mean what you did for me? You didn't do nothing for me, you fuck! Fucking bastard, you're a fucking bastard. Stop it, what? Fucking bastard. Come on, what are you doing?
And yet, as for the Ringo Kid, Johnny Boy is young, vibrant, and certain of how to conduct himself in his world. Like the Kid, he isn't always correct in his thoughts, but he nonetheless believes himself to be correct. What kid at that age wouldn't? And is confident of his success in the world of crime. The end of Mean Streets is not optimistic. Johnny Boy gets shot in the neck by the loan shark and staggers off into an alleyway, and his fate is unknown. But we also do not know the fate of the kid and the showgirl either. All we know is that they headed off to an uncertain, perhaps happy future that is unencumbered by the mores of civilization. Johnny Boy, too, heads off to an uncertain future, also unencumbered by the mores of civilization. Goodfellas was released in 1992, almost 20 years after Mean Streets, and is one of Scorsese's best gangster movies. Goodfellas recounts the story of a lower-level crew headed by Jimmy the Gent Conway, played by Robert De Niro, that is associated with the Lucchese Mafia family in New York, and how they make a living by conducting scams and robberies. The story is narrated by Henry Hill, played by Ray Liotta, who often collaborates both with Jimmy and Tommy DeSimone, played by Joe Pesci, the third member of Burke's crew. None are formal made members of the mob, although Tommy, as the sole full-blooded Italian, is eligible to become one and yearns for the promotion. Despite their initial successes, the gang starts to fall apart due to internal tensions and excessive drug use. At the end of the movie, Tommy has been murdered by the mob, and Henry becomes state's evidence against Jimmy, who is convicted and sentenced to prison.
Wanted to be a gangster.
Jimmy the Gent is Scorsese's Nathan Brittles. Like Brittles, Jimmy's at the peak of his abilities. He is a huge moneymaker for the Lucchese family, very popular, respected by both his team and his peers, and conducts all of his tasks in a highly skilled manner. Scorsese introduces Jimmy at his best, a top earner during the golden age of mafia influence, and he stays in this lofty position for most of the remainder of the movie. Jimmy and his crew during this time are operating at peak efficiency, and due to the money they make and spend, are masters of their world. Like Brittles, Jimmy is a leader, well respected by his crew. He plans and executes his heists with complete efficiency, and is so professional about it that even his victims are sympathetic. Crimes are bloodless, and are portrayed almost as harmless fun and games. In Henry's first big caper, the background music is actually Henny Youngman doing a stand-up routine.
I've never been before. I said, try the kitchen. Dr. Welser was here, wonderful doctor. Gave the guy 6 months to live. Couldn't pay his bill. Gave him another 6 months. I love this crowd.
This vision of an idyllic mob life is shattered 1 hour into the movie, where in a brutal scene, Jimmy and Tommy viciously beat a mobster to death. Aside from the flashback of this very scene at the start of the film, this is the first truly violent scene and the first murder portrayed in the film, and even to this date, the sheer brutality of how it is portrayed is shocking. Perhaps this is intentional on the part of Scorsese, as this scene marks the beginning of the descent of the fortunes of the gang. Although they continue to have successful heists, the tension within the gangs increases and people become paranoid of each other. Portrayals of brutal murders, absent in the beginning of the film, come thick and fast now, and they mirror Jimmy's and Henry's descent into drug-fueled paranoia. Despite Jimmy and Henry working at the peak of their game, the game is consuming them, as being a cavalry officer did for Nathan Brittles in She Wore Yellow Ribbon.
That's when I knew him.
Lon Paul Sidros, sir. Children see it? No, sir. Found them hiding in the smokehouse. Tyree, it's about time I did retire.
The future for both him and Jimmy is inevitably dark. For Brittles, the future is the setting sun at the end of the road. For Jimmy, prison for life. We saw in The Searchers and The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance that Ford's protagonist ends up alone and forgotten, doomed to die unnoticed by the very people he had saved so long ago. What end does Scorsese envision for his protagonist? The Irishman is Scorsese's last mob-oriented film to date, released in 2019. The movie is narrated by Frank Sheeran, played by Robert De Niro, who describes in flashback the story of his career as an associate of Russell Bufalino, played by Joe Pesci, a major mob boss. As he becomes more trusted, Bufalino introduces Sheeran to the labor union boss, Jimmy Hoffa, played by Al Pacino. Working under Hoffa's protection, Sheeran becomes a big figure in labor and mob circles, but his dual loyalties to Hoffa and Bufalino gets tested, as Hoffa attempts to regain control of the union after returning from prison despite the mob's wishes to the contrary. Sheeran is a tragic figure. Although he gladly helps Bufalino and fellow mob boss Angelo Bruno, played by Harvey Keitel, these jobs were impersonal. They involved disciplining, if that word can be used here, people to whom he either had no attachment or had done him a wrong. Once he becomes friends with Jimmy Hoffa, this changes. The conflict between the hot-headed Hoffa and the mob escalates, and Sheeran has to choose between, on the one hand, a good friend, sponsor, and mentor, and on the other, the mob. Turning on an old friend and sponsor causes him considerable pain, but he has no choice, and so he obeys his orders from Bufalino and kills Hoffa in the most traitorous way possible. He shoots him while he's supposed to be protecting him while Hoffa's back is turned.
Let's get out of here. Come on.
From the beginning, his lifestyle clashes with his personal life. His daughter Peggy is the moral center of the movie, much like Martin Pauly in The Searchers. Unlike Martin, Peggy is a silent observer, saying nothing, doing nothing, but nonetheless reproving Sheeran for the life he is leading. From the beginning, she is suspicious of her father's associates. A minor incident with a shopkeeper leads to a frighteningly violent confrontation that horrifies her. As the movie progresses, her perception of her father is jaded to the point that just a news report of a mob hit is enough to make her suspicious of her father's involvement. After the murder of Jimmy Hoffa, who Peggy adored, she confronts him with his failure to telephone Hoffa's wife to offer condolences. This scene is painful to watch. Not only does her expression condemn Sheeran, but for the first time she coldly confronts him out loud on his failure in front of the whole family. Her question, "Why haven't you called Joe?" is rhetorical. She knows why he hasn't called Joe. Sheeran cannot face the hypocrisy of comforting the wife of his friend and mentor, whom he had just murdered. The final scenes of the movie are poignant. Sheeran is an old man, living alone in an assisted living facility. He carries old pictures with which he reminisces with the staff, but none of them know who any of the people are. He meets with law enforcement agents, but Sheeran refuses to talk. He remains loyal to the mob until the end. But the cost of this loyalty is immense. At the end, a priest visits him on Christmas Eve to pray with him for forgiveness. The priest asks him if he feels guilty for the crimes he has committed. Although he repeatedly denies it, the years of crime have worn on his conscience. In a non sequitur, he condemns himself for the phone call he made to Jo Hoffa to console her on the disappearance of Jimmy. The priest is confused, but Sheeran, and the viewer, knows what he is talking about. As the priest leaves, Sheeran asks him to leave his room door open, and he does so. Ethan Edwards turns his back and walks away from the closing door, his family, and society. Frank Sheeran leaves the door open and waits, in vain, for his family to visit him. The open door is a painful metaphor. Sheeran wants to be a part of society, but we all know, and he does as well, that he never will. The famous film critic Andrew Sarris defined a pantheon director as one who has a personal vision of the world. To speak of their names is to evoke a self-contained world with its own laws and landscapes. The pantheon director carries specific visions and themes throughout their career and, through different movies and characters, develops these visions and themes to fit how the changing times and experiences affect the lead protagonist. In describing John Ford as a pantheon director, Sarris states, "A Ford film, particularly a late Ford film, is more than its story and characterizations. It is also the director's attitude towards his milieu." Martin Scorsese also has a personal vision of the world. His milieu is the street-tough mafia world that he experienced as a child growing up on the streets of New York City. Ford's protagonist, although tragic, sticks to his code and accepts both what he has become and his fate. In a sense, you could see the Ford protagonist's fate as being somewhat upbeat. It may not be a happy fate, but it is one that his protagonist accepts as necessary to accomplish his life's work. Scorsese's protagonist suffers a darker fate. Although he sticks to his code to the end, he regrets his life choices and the effects it had on his life. He is frightened by the impending end, finds no relief from his religion, and instead hopes for the redemptive love of his family, which he will never get. So not only does the life not pay, but there is no redemption in the end. Even if you survive the fate and are not put in prison, you are fated to a life sentence of being a prisoner of your own actions, in solitary confinement, a prison from which there is no escape.